Right. Hey, everybody. Thanks very much for being here. Hopefully, I'm not too echoey. We have the mics on for the recording largely and the online audience. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Dr. Roger Pielke Jr., who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a Professor Emeritus at the University of Colorado Boulder, where we were colleagues for several years in the Environmental Studies Department. Got his bachelor's degree in math at the University of Colorado, master's in public policy, PhD in political science, postdoc at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, or NCAR, and has written a really interesting range of things on a really interesting range of topics in broadly what I would call science policy. A lot of stuff on climate and energy, which is what we're going to talk about today. Also some stuff on sports governance. So he has this really good book called The Edge, climate books, The Climate Fix, and The Honest Broker, which I guess is kind of a general science policy book. And I think is a rarity in academia that maybe should be more common of somebody who I've always appreciated is willing to say whatever he thinks on whatever topic, regardless of whether or not people will like it. On either side. And so that's led him into fun territory like disasters and climate change and like athletes who are transgender or have differences in sexual development in women's sports, and most recently COVID origins. So, definitely a glutton for punishment. And we're really lucky to have him here. And today I wanted to ask him, and we're gonna have a fireside chat for maybe about half the time. And then I'm just going to go a little bit further away from you. So we're echoing.
If you mute
the computer should be already muted.
Yeah.
I think we're already muted in the computer
audio in the lower left.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Maybe that's a little bit better. So there have been a lot of public discussions and controversies recently in the news about climate and energy. And I thought Roger would be a really interesting person to talk to get his thoughts on this, because he's not on a team and he's somebody who's been studying this issue for a long time. And so I guess just to start, as a physical matter, when we say climate change, what do we mean, or what should we mean?
Yeah, first let me say it's great to be here. Just as a preface, I grew up in Fort Collins, went to high school there. And back in the day, some of you will know what this means. If you don't, that's okay, ask me later. This is in the day of 3-2 beer. We used to drive up to Laramie for the border war. And I have a lot of good memories coming up to Laramie from the 1980s. So it's great to be back. And I have to say also, Matt was a colleague of mine at University of Colorado, a great colleague, great friend. So it's really great to be here. So climate change. So what I tell people is when we're talking about the science of climate change, start with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We have this big international assessment that for 30 years, scientific community has been trying to assess what we know, what we don't know on all things climate. And it's not because an assessment is a Bible or a truth machine, but it gives us a common starting point. And there is some discussion now about the definition of climate change. But if you go to the IPCC and you go to their glossary and look it up, climate change is a change in the statistics of weather variables over long periods. And IPCC says decades or longer. The canonical term is 30 years by the World Meteorological Organization. But the reality is the statistics of weather, pick your favorite variable, vary on all time scales. So it's a different temperature now than when I drove up this morning. And climate varies on thousands, tens of thousands of years time scales. It is really interesting, and not a lot of people appreciate this, but the definition of climate change used in policy under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which they're meeting in Brazil right now, is different than the scientific definition used by the IPCC. The Framework Convention on Climate Change defines climate change only as a change in climate resulting from the emission of greenhouse gases. So right away, there's a big conflict between how scientists talk and think about climate change and how the policy world thinks about it. So this sets up some really interesting questions. How do you know there's been a change in the climate? Well, we need real smart people who measure things out in the atmosphere. And we need really good records for that. And once you've detected that something has changed over a very long time period, the next question is, well, why? Because the climate varies on all timescales. So it gets complicated fast, but I usually just say, let's just start with the IPCC and go from there.
So let me try to oversimplify it, and feel free to push back on that. As far as I understand, you might have to mute because we're sitting too close together when you're not talking. Sorry.
Can I see if I can just do this bad boy here?
Very close together, because when I mute mine.
I'll sit over here, Matt.
Okay.
All right.
You just got to still be in the camera view.
Nothing personal.
Sorry, audio. So as far as I understand, the global average surface temperature is warming at something like 1/2 to 2/3 a degree per decade, right? Celsius. If differences in definitions center on the human causes versus the phenomenon of climate change, what would you say is the contribution of humans to that amount of warming, where that could range, of course, to, less than that rate or more than that rate? There's some people who say that our human forcing would have us be warming faster, if not for our aerosol emissions cooling. What would be your read of the science?
So I'm lucky. In my book, The Climate Fix, I call the first chapter Dinner Table Climate Science. I was lucky. I grew up in a household with a world-leading atmospheric scientist. So apparently I learned a lot of things that kids don't get to learn, like programming in Fortran when you're in elementary school and things like that. And one of the things, I learned this from the research that my dad has done and others like Jim Hansen. If you're looking for the signature of a human influence on the warming of the Earth, the best place to look is in the oceans, not the atmosphere. So there's all sorts of arguments about atmospheric warming and temperature trends. If the question is, are humans warming the climate system? Go to the IPCC. The answer is unequivocal, of course. Humans are warming the climate system. And if you want to see the best evidence for that, look at ocean heat content. I do think that many of you will know that under the Paris Agreement in 2015, the world adopted temperature targets as policy goals. A 2-degree increase over pre-industrial values at the global level with the ambition to hold that to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's a horrible metric for policy. Number one, it's at the end of a long chain of causality. People argue about how do we best measure it. But in a policy sense, you can't modulate outcomes. You can modulate the things that cause outcomes. And so I'm very much of the view that we should be talking, not even emissions are at the end of the tailpipe. If we really want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which are primarily carbon dioxide, which climate modelers project is going to be responsible for about 80% of the forcing to 2100, the human sources are the burning of fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal. If you really want to dramatically reduce emissions, go for the low-hanging fruit. That's coal. So I'm perfectly happy just to start with the IPCC's conclusions that essentially all of the warming since pre-industrial is due to human causes. There are, every once in a while, science throws a curveball, and in recent years, warming accelerated and unexpectedly, and there is this hypothesis developing understanding that that might be due to cleaning up the air. So there's less solar energy. There's more solar energy absorbed by the Earth, less reflected. That's fine, and I'm happy for scientists to go have those debates. But from the core question of are we influencing the climate, might that have risky outcomes for us? The science is really clear on that.
So let me steel man the Paris Agreement for a second here. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, the history is, sorry, we're trying to get the feedback off here. as I understand it, the history is that the 2-degree target came from scientific ideas of what the recent geologic history of the Earth temperature range was. And the assumption was that if we stay within the limits that we've seen over recent geologic history, then that's probably safe. We're likely to avoid tipping points that people have hypothesized might occur in places like the Amazon or methane in the Arctic. And then 1.5 degrees came largely from advocacy led by small island developing states who were saying, well, the difference between 1.5 and 2 is the difference between us being in the ocean or not. So what's wrong with those rationales for those targets?
So, all right. So the targets themselves, as I said, were a bad idea to start with. But if you're going to have a target, it is kind of curious that 2.0 and 1.5 are very nice round numbers. If you take a look at the history of where those numbers came from, it's like many things in policy. They don't have a real strong foundation in empirical science. So the 2-degree target came from originally an analysis done by Nobel Prize winner William Nordhaus in the 1970s, who looked at the Central England temperature record and said, oh, over this long record we have hundreds of years, it seems to vary by plus or minus 1 degree. And so he concluded that, well, 2 degrees is the range in which humanity can thrive and develop. In the 1990s, a German government-sponsored group, which was a bit of an advocacy group, introduced the 2-degree temperature target. And it kind of caught on. Those of you who have been in this issue long enough will remember that it wasn't always temperature targets. It was concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Some of you heard of the group 350.org. That refers to a concentration. They shut down their operations last week, by the way. And earlier, the number that was used was a doubling of pre-industrial concentrations, so from 280 to 560. Then it was under the Kyoto Protocol, it was emissions accounting for different countries. And it was really only with the Paris Agreement that the temperature targets came in. The 1.5 degree temperature target was very closely related to the founding of 350.org by Bill McKibben. There was this sense, and there still is this sense, and we can talk about that, in the climate movement, that if you tell people, well, we're really worried about crossing 500 parts per million, the normal person will, the first thing they'll say is, what the hell does that mean? The second thing they'll say is, well, when is that going to happen? You say, well, it might happen about 2100. They'll be like, all right, I got to go pick up the kids at soccer and pay the bills and bug me when it's close. And so there was this idea that to create the urgency, we have to create targets that are either imminent or we already passed. So 350.org was created by Bill McKibben because the world already passed 350. And so the idea there was, oh my gosh, we're already in a crisis. We have to get back to that crisis. To solving that crisis. The 1.5 degrees had a very similar logic. It was a proposal from the small island ocean states, as you say. But the idea was that we're going to be getting very close. It's going to be imminent. It's going to increase the pressure that we can put on policymakers. One of the risks of having a target like that is essentially right now the world's at 1.5 degrees within measurement error. And again, most normal people are going to go about their lives and say, I was promised an apocalypse. This is not the apocalypse. What are these people thinking? And so there is this sense in the climate community, among close observers, that this 1.5 degree temperature target is not particularly useful anymore. There is a movement that's focused on what's called overshoot. So the idea, okay, temperatures are going to go above 1.5, but then we're going to motivate people to try to return to by sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. I think those are very risky sorts of approaches to advocacy. It's a little bit like the boy who cried wolf. What happens if it's 1.8 degrees Celsius? And there are extreme events around the world. The climate is changing, but people don't sense it's the apocalypse. I think we already see this. A lot of the the steam could be going out of the issue from that standpoint.
Couple of follow-ups there. And one, if folks find this interesting, just a shameless plug that I'm giving a talk to the econ department on the economics of climate adaptation on Friday at 2. Where's Alex? Is that right? Yeah. There you go. So one of the things that's interesting about this, is we hit 1.5 degrees, is there an apocalypse? Is the idea that even in extremely ambitious carbon reduction scenarios, we are still going to be as warm as we are today or warmer for the whole century. So for example, when Bill Nye this summer goes on CNN and says, you have a flood in Texas, right? So what do you do when you're in a hole? Stop digging. We need to get rid of all emissions. To whatever extent that flood was caused by climate change or temperature, we're going to have to adapt to that condition at least for the rest of the century and possibly worse. I call this the stopping smoking cures cancer fallacy. So how do you square the idea from a policy perspective of temperature targets or mitigation targets and ambitions with the idea that globally in the scale of decades and locally probably in a longer time scale, adaptation and development is to a first order approximation all that matters for these climate sensitive outcomes, right? One more example before I throw it to you. New Orleans was hit by Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and then Hurricane Ida in 2021. The damage and death from Ida was much lower than the damage and death rate from Katrina. And if you think of Louisiana as having 4% of America's 13% of the globe's 2% of cumulative emissions, which is what determines the temperature anomaly, that Louisiana could have eliminated its emissions in 2005 and done approximately nothing for its hurricane risk, regardless of how much climate change is contributing to the hurricane risk in that region. So how do we think about those things, kind of the long run goal of mitigation versus the adaptation really driving the bus in the short run?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. This is where climate advocacy kind of got off on the wrong foot. And this is what gets me in trouble with a lot of climate advocates. There was a time, probably about 20 years ago, and many of you will have seen Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, has a hurricane coming out of a smokestack. It's Katrina. It's spinning the wrong way, but details. But around that time, the climate advocacy movement decided that, it's similar to the 1.5 degree temperature target, that we need to be able to bring climate change home to people. This talk of temperature change by 2100 isn't going to do it. And a conscious decision, Matt Nisbet at Northeastern has written about this, a conscious decision was made by funders of the environmental movement to focus on extreme events as the public face of climate advocacy. Extreme events are fantastic for that purpose. Guaranteed, somewhere on planet Earth today, there's some extreme events happening. And they're very photogenic and they have impacts tragically. And they can be used to get a lot of attention. The scientific problem with that is, as you say, and again, don't take it from me, go read the IPCC. If the world were to embark today, it is not doing this, on a dramatic reduction in emissions to get to net zero by 2050, or pick your favorite number, being able to detect change in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, its effect on weather is not just decades, but over a century. It's very hard to see those because extreme events, it turns out, even though they're very telegenic, are a really bad place to look for changes in climate. Remember, a change in climate refers to a change in the statistics of weather. And extreme events, by definition, are rare. So I'll give you an example. Let's say we're going to play blackjack. Got a deck of cards. And I'm going to engage in deck change, like climate change, but deck change. But it's going to be certain, 100% certain. I'm going to add 2 aces to the deck. And then we're going to play blackjack. How many hands would you have to play before you have evidence that the deck has been stacked? Right? It would be a lot of hands. Put it in Chat GPT, they'll tell you. But it's similar. So let's say hurricanes have become 10% more intense by 2100, which is not what they're projected to do, but let's just say that. When would we be expecting to detect those changes? It's very easy for people to say, oh, look at Hurricane Melissa that hit Jamaica. It was very extreme. QED, that's climate change. If you look at what climate models say with respect to extreme weather events, we're not supposed to be able to detect those changes today under the IPCC's framework. And so this is where climate advocacy has gotten way out in front of where the science is. That's a difficult challenge. Now, as you say, one of the greatest success stories of science, technology, and policy of the last century has been humanity's ability to reduce its vulnerability to extreme events. It is incredible. If you go back to the 1870s, so this is that pre-industrial period to which we want to return temperatures, and you ask the question, how many people died on planet Earth in the 1870s related to extreme weather events? The answer is something like 50 million. The 1877-78 El Nino event had resulted in massive drought and famine around the world. The estimates are that something like 4% of the world's population died in that decade due to extreme weather events. You can put in your head what 4% of 8.5 billion is today. It's a big number. It's a real big number. That number has decreased by an order of magnitude every 50 years over the last 150 years. This is a little fact that you can take to happy hour this week. And it's still November. There's still weeks left in the year. But if you go by the data kept by the EMDAT group in Belgium, Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters, so far to date, 2025 has the least deaths worldwide from extreme weather events than any year recorded before. And I would allege this is the least in human history because they only go up, 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 up when you go back in time. One of the great success stories is the response of countries and communities in the Indian Ocean basin, India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, to cyclones. I have a paper from the Bulletin of American Meteorological Society from the 1960s. It has a table of deaths in the Indian Ocean basin from tropical cyclones. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands every year. And there's still people that die from extreme events, and we certainly can do better. But fortunately, those very large loss of life events are increasingly rare worldwide. Why is that? Well, we're wealthier, we have satellites, we have warnings, we have hardened infrastructure. Bangladesh in particular has done a great job in having evacuation shelters that are built up over the river, in this river delta there. And so the Texas tragedy with the girls in the camp reveals there's a lot that can still be done. And we could talk about that. That's a tragedy from start to finish that never should have happened because we have the technology, we have the knowledge. You start by not putting little girls in a floodplain, but and as we've seen, I mean, Katrina was a large 1,800 people died. It's not a weather event, but you go to the Boxing Day tsunami, a couple 100,000 people died. So there's still scenarios where there's large loss of life. But the simple reality is, if we care about people impacted and displaced by extreme weather events, then the answers are better adaptation, reducing vulnerability, and that happens through development. If anyone who promises they're going to reduce loss of life or impacts of weather through greenhouse gas mitigation, they're selling you something. At the same time, greenhouse gas mitigation makes a lot of sense, but for a lot of other reasons than trying to control weather impacts.
I want to follow up on what those other reasons are. Sorry, can you just hand me your box and then I'll just manage it?
Uh-oh, I'm getting my box taken over.
Yeah, if you just, there. I'll just take turns with who's muted. There we go. Now there's, yeah, there you go. Cancel culture in the palm of my hand. So first of all, I wanted to plug Roger Substack, the honest broker, really insightful commentary on a lot of these things, including the disaster in Texas. I thought you had one of the best articles on that I read. But I want to follow up on what you just said at the end there, which is that emissions reduction makes a lot of sense for a lot of other reasons. What are those reasons? And then after that, I want to ask you about whether or not CO2 should be classified as a pollutant with respect to the EPA. But let's talk first about what are those reasons.
All right. So one of the things to understand about decarbonization and reducing emissions from fossil fuels. I'm going to give you a technical term. I think we're in a business school, so I can do that here. If you take carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP, right? So it's the emissions intensity of the economy. You take a look at that measure, it's been going down since our data begins in the 1960s in a straight line. The economy has been decarbonizing for 50 or 60 years. And we might ask, well, why is that? It doesn't mean emissions are going down. The rate of decarbonization has to be higher, larger than GDP growth for that to go down. But we have become much more carbon efficient in our economic activity. There's really only two main reasons for that. One is we are very good at getting more efficient in how we conduct economic activity. Obviously, more efficiency leads to greater profits. People like to make money. And so if you can get more output for less input, then efficiency is a very good thing. The second factor, a big factor, is we have been moving on a planetary scale from carbon-intensive fuels to less carbon-intensive fuels. Coal is the best example. Globally, coal peaked in 2007 with the exception of China and India. China and India are big exceptions, but coal use ticked up last year, but it's expected not to continue to ramp up. And so the reasons why we would continue to decarbonize is you can fully expect economic activity to progressively become more efficient as we go forward. But really the weight is going to have to fall on the carbon intensity of the fuels that we use. There are good reasons for countries to become more energy secure, and the increasing demand for electricity, for example, has caused countries around the world to rethink how they're producing their energy. For example, Microsoft announced it was going to restart 3 Mile Island. Some of you aren't old enough to know, 3 Mile Island, why is that a big deal? It was in the 1970s. There was a nuclear accident. I think like a month later, a movie came out with Jane Fonda, China Syndrome, and big fear about nuclear power. The fact to me, the biggest issue there wasn't that Microsoft said they were going to restart it. They kept the name despite its baggage. Just in the last couple of days in Japan, it was announced that they're restarting it's the largest nuclear power plant in the world. And so this insatiable demand for electricity from data centers and AI is causing companies and countries to rethink how they get their electricity. And the big focus is on natural gas, nuclear, solar, and batteries have a bright future. Despite what you might hear from the President of the United States, big, beautiful coal doesn't have a future for economic reasons in the US. China has said they're going to peak. We'll see if they peak in their coal. But all of that is to say that the winds are blowing in the direction of decarbonization already without climate policy, without a push. That doesn't mean it's going to lead to deep decarbonization or net zero. But what we're talking about when we're talking about accelerating decarbonization of the economy is taking virtuous things that are already going on and making them happening faster. For a long time, the operating theory to just deal with emissions was, oh, we have to make energy more expensive. We have to make fossil energy more expensive, maybe through a carbon tax, cap and trade. Maybe we'll have a leave it in the ground campaign. So we won't have supply, and if you have less supply, it'll cause the price to go up. That is never going to work for political reasons. People don't like higher priced energy. When they have higher priced energy, they put on yellow vests in France and they protest, or they vote for populist candidates who tell them they'll lower energy prices. So there are a lot of good reasons why we should be moving in the direction of accelerating decarbonization. I'll be the first person to tell you, nobody knows how we're going to get that last ton of carbon dioxide out of the economy. But the good news is we don't have to know that in 2025. The analogies I use, get in a time machine, go back 100 years. The average human lifespan on planet Earth was in the late 30s. So 39 years old, let's say. In the 100 years that followed, we doubled that on a planetary scale. If you went to public health and medical professionals in the 1920s and you said, how are we going to double human lifespans in 100 years? They would say, hell if I know. Think about agricultural production. If you would have gone back 100 years ago and said, how are we going to feed a planet of 8 or 9 billion people such that obesity is a bigger problem than famine? The answer would be, hell if I know. But we knew how to get started and move in the right direction. So I think a lot of the fighting over climate change and climate policy starts from the premise of people think that we have to be in opposition either to energy use or to expanding the services we get from energy. So I think I can make a pretty compelling case to anyone, whether they vote with the Republicans or Democrats, why decarbonization makes sense, sufficient that we can get started. We'll worry about the later steps later.
So I want to ask you about the EPA. So there's a debate going on right now about whether the EPA should classify CO2 as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And it has classified it as such since the Obama administration, and there's a current effort underway under the Trump administration to declassify it. If you ask people who are really supportive of the Trump administration's policy, you might hear things like Biden's interpretation of that regulation was intentionally, trying to phase out all gas-powered cars by sometime in the 2030s, and this is an onerous disaster for the economy. If you ask opponents of what the Trump administration is doing, this is a calamity that's going to, roll back all kinds of progress on greenhouse gas emissions. So my two questions related to the EPA and whether or not carbon is a pollutant is one, just as a scientist, by the definition of a pollutant in the Clean Air Act, is CO2 a pollutant or not? And what do you think are the stakes really for cutting through the noise, both for carbon reduction and for the economy?
All right. Again, there's a lot there. The first thing to say is that the definition of a pollutant is not a scientific question, not remotely a scientific question. It is a legal question. And the legal question was settled in Massachusetts versus EPA in 2007, which determined that carbon dioxide is indeed a pollutant under US law. In the dissent, Anthony Scalia, the late Anthony Scalia, complained about the definition of pollutant under US law, which is a very broad definition. And he wrote in there that under that definitions, flatulence and frisbees would also be pollutants. And he wasn't wrong, but the legal question of whether CO2 is a pollutant is legally settled. And why I say it's legally settled, if you go to the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed under Joe Biden, only by Democrats, it classifies carbon dioxide as a pollutant. If you go to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was passed only by Republicans under Donald Trump, it classifies carbon dioxide as a pollutant. So the Trump administration, if they're trying to revisit that question, they should have paid more attention to the legislation that they signed. But I think that we could talk about the endangerment finding, which is a separate issue, but the fact that carbon dioxide is a pollutant, I think is pretty well established and settled in US law.
Tell me about the endangerment finding.
All right, so the endangerment finding. So under the Clean Air Act of 1977, there's a provision that the EPA administrator should act to regulate pollution if it's found to endanger US citizens. And if you take a look at what does it mean to endanger? In that law and how that law has been interpreted in court proceedings, it's a risk management proceedings. It's a risk management question. And so the threshold for an endangerment finding under US law is like, this high off the ground. It's exceedingly low. Does climate change pose risks to the future? Absolutely, 100%. Are those risks super large or super small? Well, we could debate that question, but does it pose risks? Yes. So I've argued, I was in a debate in DC, 6 weeks ago on this question. The interesting question, I think, legally is not associated with science. Does climate change pose risks? I think the more interesting question is, all right, given that it poses risks, what sort of regulations might make sense in response? And here, people can have legitimate arguments on costs and benefits, what should be put in place. Now, the way that the Trump administration is going after the endangerment finding is actually not based on challenging science. I'm sure they have a little window dressing there, on science, but the real questions are legal questions, such as the major questions doctrine. Can EPA does EPA have the authority to regulate economic activity across the economy? If I'm a betting person, I would say that the current Supreme Court very well might side with the Trump administration, but that would not be based on the science or reinterpreting the law, but some finer technical details about EPA authority in the economy.
So you alluded to the administration's debate about the science. As some of you may know, there was a report released by the Department of Energy that created a lot of buzz and some controversy, revisiting some scientific and economic questions related to climate change. And again, depending on who you ask, this was either a major necessary corrective to the horribly biased national climate assessments, or this was a political bastardization of science in service of pretext for this EPA decision. And one of the things that you wrote about it that I actually thought was really interesting was there's a lot of overlap in terms of the views of those two, of say the last National Climate Assessment and the DOE report and the IPCC Working Group 1. So my first question about the DOE report is, what are some big issues that the DOE report agrees with previous national climate assessments on, and what are some big areas where you say there's disagreement? And then we'll get into who's right.
Yeah. So just a little bit more context. Chris Wright, who's Secretary of Energy, he's a Denver guy, a Colorado guy. I know him. I knew him before he was Secretary of Energy. We're about the same age. He went to the wrong high school. If you know anything about Colorado, he went to Cherry Creek. So I try not to hold that against him. But he was the CEO of Liberty Energy, natural gas company, very successful serial entrepreneur. I don't know, worth a bazillion dollars or something. So more power to him for being successful. But he has had, I don't know, kind of an itch in his craw about climate change and climate science, being from the energy industry, and has his company and his foundation that he created wrote a report every year saying, this is what climate science actually says, and you won't read in assessments. And my view, I don't have any inside information, but my view is when he went to Washington, he thought, okay, I can use my position as Secretary of Energy to try to open up the discussion of climate science to some voices that have been marginalized or pushed, on the outside. So he commissioned this report from 5 very prominent scientists, but who are labeled pejoratively as skeptics or contrarians, to highlight issues that they thought were not adequately represented in the US National Climate Assessment, and to some degree the IPCC. And so they issued that report. And the way things happen in climate science is you're either the devil or you're with the Lord. And there's nothing in between. And so this became very polarized very quickly with a lot of, I would say, activist climate scientists saying these people don't know anything, they're a bunch of morons, there's nothing of value here. And then people on the other side saying, well, you can't trust anything in climate science. There's a few things to as you said, to recognize. One is the overlap in claims between the two reports is substantial. The most cited document in the DOE report is the IPCC. So if I'm not in charge of climate advocacy, but if I was, I would have taken that DOE report and say, well, thank you very much. This crosses that low bar for the EPA endangerment finding. Sure, there's some disagreements down in the weeds on the particulars, and we can iron those out. But that, in my view, that report would have been sufficient to clear that bar. Another thing to recognize, that report motivated a response from the US National Academy of Sciences, which had a very prestigious panel that put out their own report. If you take a look at the DOE report, National Academy of Sciences report, there are no overlapping references between the two reports, right? So they're in different scientific universes. I will tell you, full disclosure, my work and his work and some of my other colleagues are the most cited papers in that DOE report. In all of the hullabaloo that followed, all of the criticism, all the media attacks, not one of them addressed any of our work that was cited in the DOE report that arguably did not get sufficient attention either in the National Climate Assessment or the IPCC. My view very much is the over-the-top response to that report. And there's some questionable things in there, such as the importance of global greening. More carbon dioxide means more plants, or the rate of sea level rise. Have your arguments about them. But one of my theories is that the over-the-top response was to focus on the worst examples in there so that people would ignore the really good science that's in there, which is obvious. Because I do think there are some aspects of climate research that are overlooked in the mainstream assessments. We could talk about that. And if I was Chris Wright, if I was in charge, I would say, you guys on the national academies and you 5 authors, get in a room together like adults and hash it out. Tell us where you agree. Tell us where you disagree. My view is not much of the disagreements are going to be particularly policy relevant, but instead of having the Hatfields and McCoys of scientific research, just get together. And it's okay for people to disagree. The climate's super complicated. So if somebody says, I think there's more hurricanes, and somebody else says, I don't think there are more hurricanes, they're both legitimate views. Get together. What data are you using? What's the methodology? What do the statistics say? Put it out there and let people argue about it. So to me, the DOE report process didn't really reveal, that there's a conspiracy, there's something wrong with climate science. It revealed to me that the climate science community is deeply, deeply broken.
Quick follow-up to that. Do you think, so just by way of background for those who don't know, Roger's and my work that was extensively cited by the DOE and the EPA basically showed that the high emission scenarios, RCP 8.5 is a common one, are both extremely unrealistic from a socioeconomic perspective, both in terms of their economic assumptions and their energy mix assumptions, and enormously overused. So they're, by far, that scenario and its successor, SSP 5.8.5, are by far the most commonly cited scenarios in the last 2 IPCC Working Group 2 impacts reports, as an example. So my follow-up question is related to that. You said that the critics of the DOE report seized on a couple of areas where the DOE authors maybe got out of their skis to tar the whole thing as awful and biased. Do you think that the DOE authors and the Trump administration, are there any instances where they might have done the same thing, maybe citing our work as an example of an area where the mainstream science was out over its skis, but then using that to tar other areas where maybe it's not?
So I'll start by saying, of course, the impanelment of the 5 DOE authors by Chris Wright was entirely a political act with political motivations, entirely. I wrote about this. I think their treatment of our work was actually pretty good. There was a time, so if I told you using—
I agree.
All right, good. Using temperature targets is a bad idea, but if we're going to use them, then let's just talk about where things are. The community in 2014, as recently as 2014, would have said, oh, the world is headed to 4 to 5 degrees temperature increase over pre-industrial by 2100. That's the same metric as, the Paris Agreement at 2 degrees. And we need to get off that 4 or 5 degree trajectory and get down to that 2 degrees. So based on our work, and importantly, that of our colleague Justin Ritchie, who wrote his PhD on this about a decade ago, those extreme emission scenarios are implausible. They're already falsified. And if you take a look at what are called current policies projections, the best estimates of where we're headed today, there's a strong consensus on this in the scientific community now. It's 2.5 degrees plus or minus by 2100. So if you went to my colleagues, 20 years ago at National Center for Atmospheric Research and said, oh, by the way, in 2025, we'll be looking at a 2.5 degree temperature change, they would have done backflips of joy because they would have thought we were going to 4 to 5 degrees. It doesn't mean climate change goes away, but it does mean that it's a much different sort of issue to deal with than one where we thought we were going to the apocalypse. This is one of the claims, and I think they probably could have written it better, but this is one of the claims of that DOE report that has been completely ignored in all of the discussion that followed. The IPCC in its last assessment report, in one of its chapters, did a kind of a nod in the direction of acknowledging this fact. And then throughout the 10,000 page report, the most commonly used scenario is one with 4.7 degrees Celsius temperature change by 2100. You can't provide good guidance to policymakers using outdated information. So I would say, assessments aren't Bibles. They're a snapshot of what the expert community thinks at a particular moment in time. And if we go about systematically excluding relevant experts because we don't like them, we don't like who they're aligned with, then the resulting assessment report risks having some real problems. And that goes, for the IPCC or the National Climate Assessment or any assessment that you might do. Last thing I'll say is the DOE report with 5 authors made no pretense of being representative of climate science. You can't with 5 people handpicked to have a certain perspective.
So one last scientific controversy I want to ask you about, and then I want to close with maybe 10 minutes on the sociology of academia and then open up for Q&A. So the last topic relates to renewable energy, right? What you might, to a first approximation, call the paradigm of the Biden administration and climate advocacy, at least with respect to rhetoric. Arguably that the policy was a little bit different. Renewables good, fossil fuels bad, right? There's a growing movement, what I would call the center, kind of including the center left, center right, whose basic perspective is energy good, all of the above, right? I don't care if it's wind, I don't care if it's solar, I don't care if it's nuclear, whatever it is, we need energy, the AI revolution, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a perspective that seems to exist, at least in parts of the Trump administration, that is fossil good, renewables bad, to the point where we're not just taking away subsidies for renewables because renewable advocates themselves say they can compete in the market now. We're trying to block, almost completed wind and solar projects. And some of the technical arguments that I've heard behind that relate to either intermittency, so that the stats that say that renewables are cost competitive are misleading because of intermittency and capacity factors. And then the other one that's more of maybe a normative policy argument that I've heard is the national security one. That if China is emerging as the place with the comparative advantage in the world on renewables, and we're the place that's emerging as the place with the comparative advantage on fossil fuels, the longer the world stays as a fossil world, the better that is geopolitically for the United States. So what's your take on those two scientific arguments, both kind of the political economy one and the energy technology one?
Yeah, let me say, I really, really try hard not to use the word renewable. If you hear me say it, I put $5 in the beer jar, because I think it lumps together a lot of things that shouldn't be lumped together. For example, solar is having a moment around the world. Solar has a great future. Wind, not so much, and we could talk about that. Although I did drive by 300 wind turbines on my way here. Wind has its place, but it's not going to be in a lot of places. the Biden administration, so a lot of what government does in technology is to invest and support the things that we want more of and regulate and penalize the things we want less of. But at the same time, I've learned from smart economists that if government gets too aggressive in trying to pick winners in the technological space, you can have a lot of inefficiencies out there. It's true, the Biden administration was very aggressive on picking what it thought were winners. At the same time, it's true the Trump administration is the mirror image. It's picking losers. And neither is a particularly sound economic approach to energy policy. When I was teaching at Colorado in my classes, I'd use the analogy of the NFL for how we approach energy policy. Everybody has their favorite team. Oh, are you team nuclear? Oh, you're team natural gas. Oh, team wind. And we fight about it because we all have our favorites. The reality is that around the world, and even in the United States, fossil fuels represent 80% plus of our energy consumption. And pick your favorite energy scenario from your favorite group, fossil fuels are going to be a big part of the energy mix past 2050. So they're here to say, even as, I mean, two things can be true at once. Everything you guys are wearing is fossil fuels. Every object you see in this room is made out of fossil fuels. Like them or hate them, we got them for a while. It is both possible to celebrate the fact that thank goodness we have fossil fuels, and we'd like to accelerate the decarbonization of the economy. Those things can be true at the same time. The world is going to consume massive amounts of energy, increased energy going forward. We in this room are among the lucky 2 billion people on this planet who have access to energy services that we take for granted, but for a long time on this planet were just unimaginable. And it's going to continue that way. There are also 6 billion plus who want to live like us. They want to be in the lucky ones also. So however you do your math, your energy math, there's going to be massive increase in energy consumption. So what that means is that there are some countries and some companies who are going to be really important for meeting that growing energy demand going forward. And as you raise quite properly, there are geopolitical implications. So either you read it in your history books or you lived through it, but the dependence of the world on Middle Eastern oil came with a lot of consequences. And right now, the world is moving in the direction of being heavily dependent on China for most modern energy technologies, nuclear, solar in particular, wind, eventually geothermal technologies, electric. And so that's on the supply side. On the consumption side, China's got the lead in electric vehicles, which are much cheaper and arguably just as good or better than the ones that we have access. They're certainly cheaper. Rare earth metals that you need to build those wind turbines I drove through, and all sorts of energy technologies, China has a stranglehold on. So the US is the largest producer of oil and natural gas. That's true. Nuclear power, we have one company in this country that can build a nuclear power plant, that's Westinghouse. If you're gonna bet on who's gonna be powering the world's demand for nuclear energy going forward, you probably wouldn't put too many chips on the United States right now. You'd probably put them on Russia or China, or maybe elsewhere. And so there are some real geopolitical questions about, does the US want to be dominant? The Trump administration talks about energy dominance. If it's restricted to just one or two technologies, it's a failing effort. So last thing I'll say, last year I did a poll with my colleague Rui Teixeira at American Enterprise Institute on what Americans think about climate and energy. And in our poll, we include some questions about energy technologies. And it turns out that the phrase, all of the above, it's the only question we asked in our entire survey where a majority of every demographic group said it was a good idea. You may have seen in New York, Governor Kathy Hochul just said, she supports all of the above. It came up in the Virginia race. All of the above doesn't mean everything all the time, everywhere. It means that every technology has its place. And it's kind of the opposite of picking winners. When we did ask Americans, to rank their energy technologies, another area of very strong consensus was that coal is not particularly popular. Like 8% picked it as their top issue. Coal has been important as power of the Industrial Revolution, but it's really dirty, and it really has a lot of environmental impacts beyond climate change. And its economics, partly by design, but its economics are much, much worse than natural gas. So I would very much like to say everything about this. The United States Congress, some of you may have heard it, Congress was an institution we used to have that passed bills and stuff. The US Congress should take up the issue of a US national energy policy. The last time that was considered was 2005. It's very hard to have a thoughtful way forward on all the dimensions of energy policy: access, cost, geopolitics, environmental impact, unless you consider all those things at once. And we have a very piecemeal, very partisan, very individual technology favored approach to energy policy, whereas China is plowing ahead on a true all of the above approach, which, if I'm a betting person, China is going to be the dominant nation in energy in the 21st century unless we get our act together.
So I want to close this portion before we switch to the Q&A by talking a little bit about the politics within science. So you often hear scientists, and also maybe their detractors outside of academia, paint who's in power with respect to climate and energy in the US as this existential issue, one way or the other, for the climate or the economy, which I find hard to square with the fact that emissions in the US have been decreasing pretty much linearly since the Bush Jr. administration, during huge swings in attitudes toward climate among the administrations. As you mentioned before, the global carbon intensity of the economy has been declining almost perfectly linearly since the 1960s. And the last three administrations have been bad for coal economically and good for oil and gas and renewables. So I find that those facts hard to square with the kind of apocalyptic rhetoric. And then if you think about, on both sides, and you think about academia, just last week you were in Cornell, invited to speak by the head of the Atkinson Center for Sustainability, and a prominent member of that center afterwards publicly called for the director of the center, who invited you, to be fired for inviting you. When you were at CU, there was a member of Congress from Arizona, Representative Grijalva, who demanded that our president investigate you for fossil fuel funding. As you joked, they could have just looked at your Exxon Ferrari, which he doesn't have, to be clear. You were called out, by the White House science advisor under the Obama administration. I've heard you many times online be called dangerous by academics, and yet not only have I not heard anything here or seen anything you've written that I would characterize as extreme with respect to either the science or the views of the average American. We're also in a strange situation in academia where, for example, you're orders of magnitude more likely to be assigned a textbook by a literal communist sympathizer in American academia, according to the Open Civilities Project, than you are to be assigned a textbook that documents the horrors of communism, which were about an order of magnitude worse than Nazi Germany, just by death count. So what the hell is going on?
Yeah, well, I asked that question when I was being investigated by Congress. Yeah, I've been pulled the middle-aged man card out. Over my career, I started as a faculty member at the University of Colorado in 2001. It is true, I left at the end of 2024. Academia has become much more partisan, both in the composition of the faculty, but also in the orientation of the institutions of academia towards politics. Some of this people will be familiar with in the statements that the university president puts out on this or that topic, which really reached a peak around 2020, 2021. But I created 2 centers on my campus, super proud of. They were research centers. And there has been an effort to institutionalize political advocacy in university organizations to a degree that I do think a lot of faculty members think their job is to run little NGOs from the university perspective, and climate change has been caught up in that. So it's one thing if your research institute is trying to eliminate early childhood deaths. That's something that advocate for that a lot of people would support and would have broad support across the nation. I think that's qualitatively different than if you set up a university center for the permanent election of Donald Trump, for example. To take a very extreme and silly example, there are forms of advocacy in a university setting that most people would say that's probably not what we really want to do. I'll give you an example. I'll pick on my home institution. I got 3 degrees from CU. I got 2 kids. One went there, one's going there. So I think it's a great institution, or it could be a great institution. But about 15 years ago, they decided to create an energy institute, Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute, RACI. It explicitly, I was one of the fellows at the very beginning, and then I left. They explicitly decided not to include fossil fuels in their energy institute. Why? Fossil fuels are evil. Fossil fuel industry people are evil. And we need to get off of them. And my point was, well, we're in a state where this was before the huge fracking boom. The Western Slope is in the communities there dependent upon fossil fuel revenues. If we say you're the enemy and we're state-funded university, they're not gonna, we're creating enemies where we don't have to. And besides, 85% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels. Shouldn't we study it as a university? So I do think there's been this orientation in universities that, particularly land-grant state universities, where faculty think that they are political players. They are actors in a big political drama. And my view is individual faculty have academic freedom. They can write and say whatever they want. Go for it. That's one of the beauties of academia. But we do not and should not have the authority to repurpose our institutions for political advocacy. And I think that's happened a lot. If you take a look at the public confidence in institutions of higher education, it has dropped across the board. It's not just MAGA Republicans. The only demographic for which support of universities has either been constant or increased are white, liberal, highly educated individuals who lean to the left. Why? Because when they look at universities and their faculty, they see themselves. If you're Black, Hispanic, not college educated, Republican, and you look at the American university, you say, no, I don't see myself there. If you're, I'm lucky, I get to go to the Western Slope of Colorado and give talks and meet people. If you ask them, do you have confidence in the University of Colorado Boulder? They do not. There's some strong animosity, and it goes both ways. If I talk to my faculty. Now, there's a few faculty that I haven't tried to reach out, but as an institution, we aren't doing a good job. And I think this is across the country. So I think on the issue of climate change, the issue has become, as we talked about, so partisan, so polarized. So many people in the climate movement see themselves as, part of a revolution that even, I like to think of myself as kind of a normal centrist person. But if
I think you're a liberal.
All right. If you look at climate and how the orientation of the community has become so much to the left, even normal people in the center, they're going to say, "Oh, you're far right." So after my talk at Cornell last week, some guy in Hong Kong and some professor at the University of Pennsylvania, said he never should have been invited. He's from the far right. And so I think that the view of academia has become a little bit warped. Fortunately, I do think there are university presidents, university leaders who realize that things have gotten kind of cattywampus in the last decade and are working really hard to try to remind people that universities are a crown jewel of the United States. We exist to serve all Americans, whether they voted for Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or anybody in between or didn't vote at all. We serve everybody. That's what we do. And if you want to be a political player, go be a political player. There's NGOs, political action groups out there. But public and private universities are not those institutions.
So here's my last question, and that relates to what to do about it. So on the one hand, you might observe, some of the facts you just recited. You might observe, I mean, again, I hate to keep coming back to this analogy, but what would the Biden administration have done if they found out that the most cited textbooks by far in schools of education were written by literal Nazi sympathizers? It wouldn't have gone well, but replace Nazi with communist, and that's the case, that's the reality, right? Look up Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So we have a problem that if the political poles were flipped, everybody who's currently in academia would recognize as a problem. On the other hand, the Dallas Fed estimated that university research and its knock-on effects contributed to something like 1/5 of U.S. productivity growth since the Second World War. So that's a huge public good that they provide, obviously through education too. And if you're, the simplest cudgel that you have as a federal government is the money. But if you look at where the money goes from the federal government, it disproportionately goes to things like cancer research and STEM, and places that arguably are, the least infected by the problems that the administration is concerned about, and maybe the most contributing to the benefits of higher ed that the administration, either does or should want to preserve. So what do we do if the Trump administration came to you tomorrow and said, Professor Pielke, how should we fix higher ed? What would you say?
So the first thing I would say is there's no political solution to the politicization of higher education. You're not going to get a solution from the federal government. You're not going to get a solution from Republicans. You're not going to get a solution from Democrats. The only way out is for university leaders to do their jobs. So at universities have a very simple mission. It has 3 parts. We do research in support of the public good. We teach the next generation of American citizens, and we do service to our communities. That's it. That's what all right. And we have professional football teams. But university missions are really straightforward. And I can tell you, in my time, my 24 years at the University of Colorado Boulder, 5 university presidents, I didn't hear one university president give a public talk about academic freedom or the need for bipartisanship or the fact that we are educating the next generation of Americans.
Until October 7th.
I didn't hear it then, and I didn't hear it at Colorado. I didn't hear any of that sort of leadership. Now, if I go to listen to Ron Daniels, who's the president of Johns Hopkins University, he wrote a book in 2020 called What Universities Owe Democracy. That's the kind of leadership that we need in universities. We need administrators and faculty who are willing to reinforce that core mission of the university. And when our colleagues and peers go, violate that mission, we got to call them out. I mean, I can tell you, this is very personal. When I was at the University of Colorado, I got put into a closet for my office. I was the most senior, most cited professor in my department. They put me in a windowless closet, and then they filled it up with file cabinets and boxes, just to let me know that I wasn't particularly welcome there. None of my faculty colleagues said anything. They would take me in the hall and say, that sucks. But I don't want them to come after me. That's a direct quote. So unless we in the academy are willing to stand up for the principles that make the academy what it is, nothing's going to change. And so the Trump administration can pursue its campaign of vengeance against university. It can withhold money. It can extort payments. That's not going to do anything. It's not going to make us better. So, I'm lucky that I'm at a think tank that has a center on the future of the American university. I get to talk to university leaders across the country. And there is a growing recognition among these leaders that if there is a social contract between the public and institutions of higher education, we can't control what elected officials do. We're not political players, but we can control what we do. And to the extent that we haven't held up our end of the bargain, let's do that. And I do think, as you say, universities contribute they punch above their weight in supporting economic growth, but also developing, what Thomas Jefferson said was necessary for democracy as an educated citizenry. That's what we do. And so let's do that. And if, there's populist presidents or there's progressive presidents, that's interesting, but that's not our business.
Okay, we got 20 minutes for Q&A. So raise your hand and I'll call on you and then state your question as concisely as you can because I'll repeat it or paraphrase it for the online audience. And we will throw it over to Roger. So.
Freshman Davidson, the NBA. So we have the free market that is already improving carbon emissions by GDP. We've got administrations that keep wanting to pick further, so we need to continue to forward policy design. We've got the advocates. What are your thoughts about getting all the politics policy out of climate change and just let the free market solve the problem? We keep having these administration changes. It seems to put up more barriers than it does just letting the free market power solve this problem.
So the gist of the question was, why can't we just have the government get out of the way in terms of these climate and energy debates and let the free market determine what the energy mix should be?
So I get the gist of what you're saying, but I'm an old policy professor. And the first response I'll say is there's no such thing as a free market. There's no free market. We live in a mixed economy where the government is like 40% of GDP. And we have government to help identify common interests and pursue them. So if it's in the common interest of the United States to not allow China to be the dominant force in energy, the quote unquote free market is not going to let that happen. The free market will probably let China dominate that because China has a state directed government. If you want the US to have the strongest military in the world to protect the nation and ensure security around the world, free market's not going to provide that defense. So I very much am a fan of efficient, smart, legitimate public policies that recognize that there are key roles for the private sector to play, key roles for the government to play, but in most cases, it's all mixed up in like a soup. And so this gets back to the comment I made about having a national discussion about energy policy. There are some things that we might let or want to say, let the free market take care of it, light bulbs. Let the best light bulb win. But if it's tanks, we're not. The US owns the only tank factory. General Dynamics runs it in Ohio. And then everything else is in the middle. And so I get your sentiment, and I think the instincts, if your starting point is the Inflation Reduction Act, I'm all with you. It makes a lot of sense. But if the answer is smart energy policy, I think we have to be far more nuanced than just free market, not free market.
Question over here. Go ahead.
So my name is Candy Cruz. I'm a second-year student in atmospheric science, and I have a background in climate. And I very much agree with you. I think that attribution science has a lot of flaws and a lot of issues. However, I was interested in picking your brain about whether or not companies that produce emissions at a large scale, do they have the moral obligation to cut back on emissions to only potentially prevent extreme weather events and save lives?
Okay, so the gist of the question was, do large fossil fuel companies have a moral responsibility to cut back on their emissions to save lives and reduce extreme weather? Did I get it close?
Even though it's uncertain in attribution science.
Even though attribution science is uncertain.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot in that question, and let's start with like the math and unpack it. The vast majority of emissions on planet Earth are not produced by companies. So let's take everybody's favorite boogeyman, Exxon. Exxon produces fossil fuels. They make gasoline. Yeah, there's some carbon dioxide emissions that result in refining and producing and drilling and so on. But you know where most of them come from? They come from you and you and you and you when you put that in your car and you burn it. So this gets, again, to that difficult question. What is the connection between carbon dioxide emissions and their immediate or near-term effects on the weather and climate system? And the answer is it's not direct and it's not short-term. So any argument that starts with should we reduce emissions to change the weather, I'm going to say, well, you're starting in the wrong place. There are plenty good reasons to reduce emissions. So I talk to a lot of folks in oil and gas, and I hear over and over, I'm not in that industry, but I hear over and over that methane leaks from producing natural gas or moving it around are technologically pretty straightforward to deal with. We also, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, there's a lot of flaring of natural gas because we can't move it from one place to another. So there's a lot of smart things that could be done to reduce emissions. I guess the last thing I'll say is if the argument is a moral argument, geez, it's going to be really hard to win that one. It would be much better if, for example, if we think that fugitive methane emissions are a problem in this country, regulate them, provide incentives for capturing them, provide incentives for building the pipelines needed to get it from one place to another, go with the direction of where the economy will go, and take advantage of economic incentives, which, for better or worse, I think companies are going to respond much better to than trying to make a moral case.
Good answer, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Over here, yeah.
My name is Camelia Moses of Purdue. I am a professor of botany here. And every year for the last 20 years, I've had a conversation on climate. And in 2026, our climate conversation is going to be about the ethical, legal, and international impact of climate justice. And when you said something about advocacy, I understood what you meant, but it's not just climate advocacy that most people are interested in. We're interested in environmental advocacy. Robert Bullock, Robert from Texas Southern University, is known as the father of climate environmental justice. And I wrote this so I can remember exactly what I should say. Climate science gives us the data, but ethics gives us the direction. And it gives us along the line of what you asked. To treat climate change solely as a technical problem is to miss its deeper significance. And it demands an ethical reckoning, a moral response rooted in justice, responsibility, and care. We must ask, what do we owe future generations? What does it mean to live sustainably? And how do we honor the interconnectedness of all life? So I would hope that we can, I gotta go teach my biology class. I came over to make myself introduced to you because I will be sending both of you an email to ask you to participate on April 17th, 2026 in our conversation. But I just like to get your perspective, piggyback off of this young man.
Yeah, great. I'm going to try to paraphrase the gist of that, although I won't be able to do justice to the full comment. But let me know if this is a friendly paraphrasing or not. So many of the issues that we face of society, if universities are laboratories of democracy, so many of the issues that we face in society are not just socio-technical issues. They're also ethical issues that touch on values. And so is there not a place in universities for that? And if there is, how do you do that justice while also honoring the issues that you were talking about before with relation to, concerns about scientists being activists? Like, I guess, is there a tension between what you were advocating for and what Dr. Okapu was advocating for or not?
I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you 100%. So if we were to take climate change as a technical problem and burning of fossil fuels, emitting carbon dioxide, then there are technical solutions to that. If we view climate change as a more macro umbrella about inequities, injustices around the world, and so on, yes, but that's a different issue. I'm going to give you a very specific example of where I think climate policy runs up against what we would call justice. So the European Union is proposing to implement something called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM. The CBAM is to put a tariff on imports from countries that don't have a price on their carbon dioxide emissions, thereby increasing that. And the idea, we're going to make unpriced carbon production more expensive. So there's a study that just came out with London School of Economics, an African foundation together, found that the implementation of that for 11 least developed countries in Africa would lead to a loss of 8% of their GDP. They didn't go all the way, but you could take an 8% loss of GDP in a least developed country and translate it into lives lost, livelihoods lost. Here's an example where I would say climate policy is leading to injustices. And so if we are to center justice and outcomes for all people, I think that's great. That makes a lot of sense. But I think we have to recognize that's going to lead to a very different sort of climate policy and politics than the one we have right now, where emissions reduction is the be-all, end-all. Last example. The climate community views the future through what are called integrated assessment models. They're models of how the world might evolve in different ways. A group in India has pointed out that all of the leading integrated assessment models foresee a future where North Americans and Europeans get a lot richer. And Asians and others, they get a fair bit richer. And then Indians and Africans, they don't get much richer at all. And these integrated assessment models say, yeah, our goal is to minimize carbon dioxide emissions, not to achieve some sort of equity in global incomes. I would say that's institutionalized injustice in the form of narrowing climate policy to one variable, which is emissions reductions. So I'm very sympathetic to that outlook, but I also view it to be quite contrary to how we're approaching climate change around the world at this point.
Okay, I want to push you a little bit on this point, because I think one way to characterize your answer would be to say that, that justice is important, and academics, as advocates for justice, and just to the extent that we are not doing a good job because we're overlooking the justice costs of climate policies that make energy more expensive or prohibit development in poor countries, right? So good point, well taken, but that doesn't quite address the initial question in terms of your earlier comment that we shouldn't be activists at all. So maybe to phrase it one way, imagine three types of academia. One where we are advocates and our lodestar is trying to advance justice, as we define it, and we do so pragmatically. One is where we are the center to debate what justice means and different values questions and different facts questions. And one where we're basically technical colleges that get all values issues out, and we try to build things and fix things and understand the world. Do you like any of those models, or is there some other one that I haven't?
I would say there's room for a lot of different approaches, and I would definitely not say there should be no advocacy on university campus. I mean, university campuses all have lobbying offices in Washington where they advocate for high science budgets. I'm an advocate for critical thinking in my students. If there's, maybe there is next door, there's the Wyoming Research Center for the elimination of maternal deaths. No one would argue with that. What I would suggest that universities have to exercise a degree of restraint in the sort of advocacy they engage in. The advocacy that becomes more and more finer grain and represents a smaller and smaller proportion of the country, it risks turning the rest of the country against the university. So yes, advocate for things that are in common interest. If it's in the special interest of me or you or some faculty cohort, create an NGO off campus. This is where we need leadership to exercise institutional restraint. There may be times where a university president issuing a statement makes a lot of sense. I don't know, the assassination of a president or a nuclear bomb going off somewhere. But at the same time, you wouldn't want the university president issuing a statement on what's leading CNN or Fox News every single day. In between those two poles is restraint and leadership. So yes, justice is the sort of thing where I would think there is a common ground, but there are, and I've seen it on campuses, and everyone has, there are forms of institutionalized approaches to justice that are very narrow and not particularly encompassing of broad views. And there's a difference there, and we should be able to talk about those and have those sorts of debates on campus.
Yeah, in the middle right here.
Yeah, 2008, large oil and gas company came down to Casper, read your Substack. Lectures every week, so really appreciate your talk today. I work in the policy improvement area, where the social cost of carbon has been used fiscally, at least in the past administration. I think there is a social cost carbon, by the way. Can you talk about that metric and whether or not you think there's a way to get to a reasonable estimate for social cost of carbon? And how does that connect to a carbon tax?
So the question is, can we come up with a reasonable estimate of the social cost of carbon, and how, if at all, should we connect that to a carbon tax and policy?
All right. So for those who don't know, the social cost of carbon is a metric that has been devised to try to estimate the damages caused by the emission of, say, 1 ton of carbon dioxide, so that we can put a price on those damages. I hold this view, and I've argued it, and a lot of other people do. The social cost of carbon is whatever you want it to be. It's not, I do think there can be a social cost of carbon, but the Trump administration's $7 a ton was probably just as justifiable as the Biden administration's $160 a ton. The methodologies are so plastic and require so many assumptions. For example, most of the damage in all of these assumptions occur after 2300. And so, of course, you can create all sorts of fancy models to come up with that number. I wrote in my book, I'm a big fan of a carbon tax, not a carbon tax that makes people feel pain at the pump because they'll get pissed off and they'll vote the other guy in. A carbon tax to raise money for investing in energy innovation. What level should that be? It should be as high as politically possible and no higher. And so what I've argued is let's start at $1 a ton. Let's just having a carbon tax is much more important than the amount. If we can get $1 a ton, that would be a massive accomplishment. If we can't, what are we even talking about? So let's get $1 a ton. And then my view very much is as the economy continues to decarbonize, the price of fossil fuel is going to be much less important to people's household budgets, to companies' budgets, and you will be able to raise that price politically. So how many of you have ever filled up your car with gasoline? Yeah, everybody. So when you do that, you pay, what is it, 44 cents a gallon to the Highway Trust Fund. Is there a social cost of highways? No. Why is it 44 cents? Because that's what Republicans and Democrats agreed on and have held steady for the last 60 years or whatever it is, 54 years. The price we eventually put on carbon is going to be politically negotiated. And we can come up with all sorts of fancy numbers that have some kind of scientific veneer. But as the flip-flopping between Biden and Trump shows, politicians can justify whatever they want with that. So I'd much rather enter the political process to get that resolved rather than trying to do it scientific.
In the back.
Historical situation that be analogous to the situation of climate change right now, either within the US or like back to the Roman Empire or anything like that.
Can you be more, sorry, I'll reverse the question. So the question was, can you think of a situation analogous to climate change in previous times? Can you be more specific about in what ways it's analogous? So the political implications of, imprecise, science on maybe on things like impacts, and maybe also, if I can abuse moderator's privilege, the large tragedy of the commons. So, any costs of adapting or mitigating are going to be borne immediately and locally, and benefits are going to be borne everywhere, and in some cases far in the future.
Yeah, as a technological challenge, I often liken it to extending human lifespans or agricultural productivity, which require many decades, better part of a century for progress to be made. In terms of the politics and the public representation of the issue, I think there's a lot of parallels with the fears of overpopulation of the 60s and 70s. In that case, we had very sophisticated, at the time, projections of how global population was going to increase. That was going to lead to famines because we couldn't feed everyone around the world. And there was a real sense of crisis. And it led to some really horrific policies like the China's one-child policy and forced sterilizations in India and elsewhere. And that issue really never went away. There's still the overpopulation folks out there. But the reality is today we're worried about underpopulation and not enough people. And I think if we look at that issue and how it matured, what we got wrong, what we got right, I do think it offers an interesting roadmap for climate because I'm very much of the belief that as population projections continue to come down, and demographics is a slow moving bus, but you have a pretty good sense of birth rates and so on. Necessarily, projections of future climate change are also going to come down. It's not going to solve the problem, but we're going to be a lot closer to 2 degrees projected in coming years than anybody thought possible. And so what happens to the issue? Right now, there's a battle. There's a battle between the apocalyptic crowd and the hoax crowd. And the reality is somewhere in between. I'm curious what happens with the apocalypse crowd. What happens when there's a general sentiment that climate change is serious, it's real, but it's not the end of the world? What then happens to the issue? And I think looking at population concerns might give us a roadmap for where they may head up.
Well, thanks. We're out of time, unfortunately. If Professor Pielke is amenable, maybe folks who have remaining questions can come up after and talk to us. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to Professor Pielke for a really interesting discussion.